Hi guys, and welcome to Last Light Radio channel. Tonight we step into the American frontier in 1815, where the day dies slowly over a rough clearing, and one lonely cabin waits under a sky so wide it seems almost watchful. You can feel the last warmth of sunset slipping off the logs beneath your hand. You can hear insects starting their thin metallic chorus in the grass. You can smell pine sap, old smoke, and damp earth cooling for the night. Out here, sleep is never just sleep. It is a wager. It is trust placed in a door plank, a fire's red eye, and your own tired nerves. What happens when the dark is bigger than your courage, and the nearest neighbour might be miles away through black timber? So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And while you are here, comment your location and local time, so this little night watch can stretch across the world. Now, dim the lights, and let the last streaks of evening fade over the clearing as you stand with one hand on the cabin latch and the wilderness at your back. The cabin is not much to look at, which in 1815 makes it perfectly respectable. The logs are uneven, the gaps stuffed with clay and moss, and the roof looks as if one sharp argument with winter could send half of it sliding into the yard. Still, it is shelter, on the frontier. That word has a sacred tone. Shelter means walls, and walls mean a few extra heartbeats if trouble comes. You pause on the threshold before stepping inside. The air in the room holds the stale smell of yesterday's ash, rough timber, and a faint sour trace from wet wool drying too slowly. It is not pleasant, exactly, yet it feels almost luxurious after the open woods. Your boots drag a little dirt over the puncheon floor, those split logs laid flat side up to make something that only generously qualifies as flooring. It is hard, splintered, and cold through the soul. You set down your small bundle. That sound lands heavily in the room. Everything sounds heavier in a lonely cabin. A folded blanket thumps like a body. A tin cup rings like a warning bell. Even your own breath seems louder than it should. No one tells you that solitude changes the size of sounds, but it does. A mouse in the wall can begin to resemble a burglar with very delicate manners. Outside, the last pale gold light drains through the trees. It catches on the edge of the clearing, turning dry grass silver for a moment before the colour disappears. The forest beyond does not simply grow dark. It gathers itself. The trunks stand closer together as the light thins, and the spaces between them turn from brown to grey, to a deep, patient black. You understand why so many frontier diaries speak of the woods as if they were alive. After sundown, the idea feels less like poetry and more like useful caution. You move quickly now, not because you are afraid, at least not officially, but because daylight on the frontier is a kind of money. Once spent, it is gone. You crouch near the hearth and stir the old ashes with a stick. A few sleepy sparks answer. Good, very good. A dead fire means extra work, and extra work at dusk feels like an insult from the universe. You feed the coals with thin twigs first, then thicker pieces, then a split log. Soon the flame licks upward with a low greedy rustle, and the room shifts at once from dead space into a human place. Fire changes everything. Its light pushes against the corners, though not very far. It warms your face while your back stays cool. It gives the cabin a pulse. You hold your hands toward it and feel the skin tighten pleasantly under the heat. Smoke curls up, misses the chimney's idea of cooperation, and leaks a little into the room. Your eyes sting. Your clothes catch the smell. By morning you will wear the scent of wood smoke like a second shirt, which on the frontier is almost a social category. You take stock of what surrounds you. A stool with one leg slightly shorter than the others, a crude shelf with a tin plate, a small iron pot, and a horn spoon. A bed frame of poles fitted together by practical hands rather than elegant ones. Over it lies a tick mattress stuffed with straw or dried leaves, depending on luck and honesty. Tonight it looks lumpy enough to raise theological questions. Still, it lifts you off the floor, and that counts for a great deal. In 1815, cabins like this spread across the American frontier from New York's western reaches to the Ohio Valley, Kentucky, Tennessee, and beyond. Thousands of families and solitary travelers lived inside rooms just like this, often in structures raised astonishingly fast. Some log houses went up in a matter of days with neighbourly help. That sounds charming until you remember that speed was often a necessity, not a hobby. Winter did not care about craftsmanship. You unstopper a small flask and take a measured sip of water. It tastes faintly of wood and metal. You make it last. A person alone at night learns to respect supplies with a seriousness that city people reserve for legal documents. There is no shop around the corner. There is no convenient errand to run. There is only what you have, what you forgot, and what you can improvise before darkness becomes complete. The crickets outside begin in earnest now. Their steady chirring spreads through the grass in waves, so regular it almost becomes a fabric. Wind moves through the trees above them with a different voice, a longer one, a restless brushing sound that swells and sinks. Then comes the occasional click of cooling wood in the wall behind you, sharp enough to turn your head. Cabin life trains the ear ruthlessly. You learn to separate harmless sounds from alarming ones, though never with perfect confidence. You step back outside for one final look around the clearing. The evening air touches your skin with a coolness that feels damp at the edges. Somewhere nearby lies a patch of crushed mint or pennyroyal underfoot, and a green smell lifts when you shift your boot. The sky's deepening into indigo. One star appears, then another, then several more, scattered overhead with insulting calm. Nature loves to be beautiful at the exact moment it becomes inconvenient. Near the woodpile, you inspect the ground. No fresh prints leap out in the weak light. Maybe deer, maybe nothing. Frontier people watch the dirt almost as closely as the sky. Tracks could tell you whether a raccoon had raided the corn, whether a stray hog had wandered through, or whether a stranger had come near the cabin while you were absent. Historians know that many settlers became extraordinary readers of traces, though it is harder to recover those skills from the written record because most people did not think to describe what they considered ordinary knowledge. You gather another armful of wood. Bark scrapes your forearms, splinters snag at your sleeve. The pieces are heavier than they looked, because wood always is after a full day. Back inside, you stack them near the hearth in a tidy little row. Tidy habits matter when you are tired. A cluttered room at night is not merely ugly, it is treacherous. One stumble in darkness can dump hot embers, spill your powder, snap a tool handle, or bruise a shin so thoroughly you begin bargaining with heaven. Your rifle rests near the wall. You place it where your hand can find it even without light. This is not melodrama, it is procedure. On the frontier, weapons were tools long before they were symbols. A gun meant meat if you were lucky, defence if you were not, and constant maintenance regardless. Black powder firearms in 1815 were useful but temperamental companions. Dampness spoiled powder, fouling clogged the barrel, and a misfire at the wrong moment could make a person feel suddenly philosophical. An axe leans near the door, a knife goes beside the bed, a candle stub waits on the shelf. You do not expect drama. You simply prepare for inconvenience in all its forms. That is one of the quieter truths of frontier survival. Much of it depended less on heroism than on small repeated acts of caution. Legends prefer the charging horse and the shouted warning. Real life often preferred checking the latch twice. The latch itself is simple. A wooden bar and iron fittings with no grand illusion of luxury. You test it once. Then again. The door gives a little when pressed, but holds. Good enough. That phrase carried half the continent westward. Good enough roof, good enough shoes, good enough harvest, good enough sleep. You kneel by the hearth to heat a bit of supper. Nothing grand appears from your stores. Perhaps cornbread hardened from the morning, a strip of salt pork, maybe a few beans if fortune has smiled recently. The smell that rises from the pot is plain and heavy. All grease and grain and smoke. It is not food for conversation. It is food for persistence. You eat slowly from the tin plate, listening between each bite. The spoon taps softly. Fat pops in the fire. A night insect throws itself against the tiny window opening with a dry little tick. There is comfort in eating alone, though not much romance. No one reaches for your portion. No one talks while you chew. No one pretends frontier meals were convivial scenes painted in warm colours. Often they were silent because everyone was busy being tired. A curious fringe tale from some early settlements claimed that certain lonely cabin dwellers talked aloud to their bread starter or iron pot just to hear a human voice answer in the room, even if only by imagination. That may sound comic, but isolated living can make conversation with cookware seem almost strategic. Darkness settles firmly now. The window is no longer a view. It is a square of blackness, reflective enough to show the firelit side of your face if you glance at it the wrong way. You do not enjoy that. Seeing yourself suddenly in a black pane at night is unsettling even when you know perfectly well whose nose that is. You look away and add another stick to the fire. The bed waits in the corner with stoic indifference. You touch the blanket first. Wool, coarse and slightly scratchy, but dry. Thank heaven for that small favour. Damp bedding is a frontier misery all its own. The mattress rustles when pressed. Something inside shifts with a whispering crackle. Straw, most likely. You imagine the number of little stems poised to poke you through the night and decide not to count them. Many people on the early American frontier slept lightly and rose often. That was partly habit, partly necessity. Night fires needed tending. Livestock might make noise. Weather could change abruptly. Illness, childbirth, travellers, and wandering animals paid no attention to civilized hours. The ideal of 8 uninterrupted hours belonged more to wishful thinking than to cabin life. Sleep came in portions, stitched together like a patched shirt. A gust of wind slips through some fine, invisible gap in the wall and brushes your neck. Instantly your skin tightens. Cold has a talent for finding the exact place where clothing fails. You stuff a bit more moss into one crack between the logs, pressing it with your thumb. Crude, but useful. Frontier homes were full of these endless tiny negotiations with the elements. Rain entered, smoke lingered, frost formed, dust settled. You lived among materials that were still half wild. Then you hear it. A long-distant call, thin and rising through the trees. You stop with your hand on the wall. For a moment the crickets seem to pull back. The fire murmurs. The night outside holds its shape. Then the sound comes again. Farther off than fear first claimed, but very much real. A wolf, perhaps, or several, somewhere beyond the clearing and deeper in the timber. In 1815, wolves still roamed much of North America in numbers that later generations would find hard to imagine. They were more often a threat to livestock than to people, yet their voices had a way of entering the human mind and enlarging every lonely thought. You stand absolutely still, listening. Nothing follows but wind. This is often the hardest part, not the sound itself, but the waiting after it. Your mind begins its old tricks. Was it one animal or more moving nearer or away hungry, or merely speaking into the dark as creatures do? Frontier nights made philosophers of some people and fools of others. Occasionally, both before dawn, you lower yourself onto the stool near the fire and let your hands rest loosely in your lap. The heat reaches your knees. The rest of the room remains cool. Shadows move on the wall behind the rifle, making it seem to twitch, though it does not. You breathe in smoke, ash, wool, and the faint animal smell of your own worn clothes. A strange peace begins to settle, not because the night has grown safer, but because you have finally stopped fighting its existence. Historians still argue whether frontier loneliness has been exaggerated by later writers who preferred drama over routine. Some accounts dwell on terror, while others describe long, quiet evenings of mending, reading scripture, shelling corn, or simply going to bed early from fatigue. The truth was likely less theatrical than legend and more demanding than nostalgia. Most nights, Nothing happened. That was precisely why each small sound mattered so much. You feed the fire one last stick and watch the flame bend around it. The logs glow red at the seams. Outside, the crickets keep on with their patient music. Somewhere in the black distance, the woods breathe and shift and mind their own ancient business. Inside this rough cabin, under a roof that is barely persuasive, you prepare to lie down alone on the American frontier in 1815 with only a latch, a fire, and your own steady heartbeat for company. The room settles into evening the way a pond settles after a tossed stone, slowly, almost politely, though little disturbances keep surfacing. Firelight folds over the walls in wavering bands of orange, then slips back again, making every knot in the wood look like an eye with a private opinion. You sit near the hearth with your supper in both hands, feeling the tin plate warm your palms while the rest of the cabin stays cool and faintly damp. Outside, the crickets carry on without pause. Their song is so steady now that silence would feel more alarming than noise. You eat because a body needs it, not because the meal inspires poetry. Salt pork gives off a heavy scent, rich and sharp, while a heel of cornbread waits to be softened by broth or stubborn chewing. Frontier food is honest in the least flattering way. It does not pretend to be delicate. It arrives with grease, smoke, and labour attached. You cut a piece with your knife, taste the salt, and feel the day's hunger meet it with gratitude. A few beans, softened in the iron pot, bring their plain, earthy comfort. It is a meal designed by necessity rather than imagination, though necessity can be surprisingly sustaining. The spoon scrapes the bottom of the pot in a slow circle. That small sound fills the room. So does the pop of sap inside a burning log. So does the whisper of your sleeve brushing your knee. A person alone learns very quickly that hearing has moods. At noon, a twig snapping nearby might go unnoticed. At night, inside a cabin, the same sound can persuade your heart to perform gymnastics. You do not entirely trust your own nerves, but you respect them enough to keep listening. Many frontier cabins held little in the way of proper furniture. A table, if there was one, might be made from rough boards set on simple legs. Stools were common. Benches did the work of chairs. Chests stored clothing, tools, and whatever precious dry goods had survived weather, rodents, and hard travel. Even so, families often took pride in small touches of order. A shelf carefully arranged, a pewter spoon polished as well as circumstances allowed, a blanket folded neatly. These gestures were not vanity. They were signs that life had not slipped entirely into chaos. You wipe the plate with the last piece of bread. No crumb deserves retirement while supplies are limited. Then you pour a little water into the pot, swirl it, and hold it near the coals so the heat can loosen what clings. Cleanliness is never fully achieved out here, but it is pursued with determined compromise. Grease gone is better than grease lingering. A rinsed spoon is not a sterile spoon, but it is less likely to surprise you unpleasantly tomorrow. The smell around the hearth grows fuller as supper ends. Smoke presses down from the chimney in lazy breaths. Hot fat cools on metal, damp wool, ash, and the resin scent of split pine mingle into a fragrance that would make no perfumer rich. Yet, it belongs perfectly to this life. Your clothes absorb it. Your hair absorbs it. The blanket on the bed certainly absorbs it. By morning, the whole place will smell like a campfire that decided to become architecture. You set the washed pot upside down on the shelf and feel a little satisfaction from that one completed task. Such moments matter more than anyone in a comfortable house would guess. Work done before sleep means less confusion if the night turns troublesome. A misplaced cup can be knocked over. A knife left carelessly on the stool can find your hand the wrong way in darkness. Order is a quiet ally. It asks no praise. The candle stub receives your attention next. You pinch the wick between thumb and finger, straightening it gently, then settle the candle in a crude holder near the bed. Tallow candles often smelled faintly animal when burned. which is one of those historical details people rarely put in paintings. Paintings prefer noble moonlight. Real rooms preferred whatever could be made to shine. When lit, the candle sends out a pale, greasy scent beneath the stronger breath of the fire. Its flame is weak compared with the hearth, but useful. It reaches corners the fire only threatens. On some frontier evenings, people read by that sort of light if they had the luxury of a book and enough energy left in their bones. Bibles, almanacs, hymnals, and a handful of treasured volumes circulated through many settlements. Literacy rates varied by region and circumstance, but reading aloud was common wherever print existed. Yet after a hard day, even a beloved page could swim before tired eyes. Plenty of nights ended with no finer entertainment than chewing, mending, and staring into the flames with a face that had simply had enough. You take up a shirt that needs a bit of repair. The cloth feels coarse under your fingers, worn thin at the cuff. Needlework by firelight is not kind to the eyes, but frayed clothing does not mend itself from pure patriotism. You thread the needle with care, squinting slightly as the point glints. Then you begin, drawing the thread through in small, even motions. In and out, pull and tighten. The rhythm is calming. It gives your hands something sensible to do while your ears remain half-tuned to the world outside. Wind moves across the clearing and presses briefly at the wall, making the chinking creak. A looser person might call it atmosphere. You call it a reminder that the cabin is a negotiation between trees and weather, not a victory over either. The logs shift subtly as the night cools. Somewhere overhead a board gives a dry complaint. Frontier houses were never entirely still. They breathed, leaked, settled, and objected. Living in one meant developing a relationship with complaint. A small scratching begins near the lower corner of the wall. You stop sewing. It comes again, then pauses, then resumes with tiny urgent strokes. Not a bear, unless bears have recently taken up delicate handiwork. More likely a mouse. Frontier cabins and mice knew each other far too well. Stored meal, grain, scraps of cloth, and warm nesting spots made cabins irresistible to them. Cats helped when present, traps helped when remembered. Most people simply developed a tired familiarity with the little intruders. The frontier offered many noble challenges. Rodents remained distinctly unromantic. You tap the wall lightly with the handle of the needle. The scratching halts. Good. For now. You return to the seam, though not without a slight narrowing of the eyes toward the corner. History gives us many grand speeches and military campaigns, but far less attention goes to the ancient nightly contest between householders and nibbling creatures. That omission feels unfair to householders. A gust pushes a ribbon of cooler air through the door crack and curls around your ankles. The touch is sudden and intimate, like cold water finding its way into a boot. You rise, fetch a scrap of cloth, and wedge it along the lower edge. It helps a little. Little helps count. On winter nights, such measures could mean real comfort. In milder weather, they simply prevented the feeling that the outdoors had rented a small corner of the room. You glance toward the window opening. Instead of glass, perhaps there is an oiled paper covering, or maybe a wooden shutter now closed against the dark. Glass existed on the frontier, of course, but it was costly, fragile, and not universally available. Oiled paper, stretched and greased, let in a blurred sort of light by day while keeping out some wind. It offered no pleasing view, but frontier life often ranked utility above scenery. The stars could remain outside where they were decorative and harmless. You reach for the flint and steel, checking them out of habit. Dry. Good. Fire-making tools deserve respect bordering on affection. A settled hearth is one thing. Rekindling from stubborn tinder in bad weather is quite another. Many households bank the fire overnight under ashes, preserving a live bed of coals for morning. Starting fresh every day wasted effort and patience. Few resources were more precious than a spark that cooperated. Scholars still debate how much frontier domestic labour has been underestimated in popular memory. The popular imagination lingers on hunting, clearing trees, and dramatic encounters, all of which certainly mattered. Yet the endless management of food, cloth, fire, dirt, and comfort occupied vast portions of daily life. These tasks rarely thunder, they accumulate, their weight is quiet, which is perhaps why it escapes notice until someone must do it alone. The shirt is mended well enough to survive another day. You fold it and place it beside your other things with care. Then you take off your boots and set them upright near the hearth, close enough to dry, but not so close that the leather hardens or the soles curl. Wet boots can ruin a day before it begins. Even dry ones carry the memory of miles. When your stockinged feet meet the floor, the wood feels rough and chill. You wince slightly. It is a floor that believes in character building. The fire settles lower, losing some of its lively crackle and turning to a steadier glow. Red seams open inside the logs. Blue edges flicker where flame clings. You add one split piece and watch it catch slowly, first blackening, then showing a thread of orange. Fire rewards patience and punishes carelessness. Too much wood at once can smother it. Too little invites a cold room at the most inconvenient hour. Getting it right feels oddly personal, as if the hearth is judging your competence in silence. The cabin air grows drier as the heat rises. Your skin, cooled by the evening outside, begins to warm. The sensation is strongest across your shins and hands. Your shoulders remain slightly tense, as though the body refuses to admit the workday is over until every chore has been counted and dismissed. So you count again, quietly, food put away, water checked, tools set, door barred, candle ready, blanket aired. The list is simple. Its completion is deeply reassuring. Outside, the wind changes direction. You hear it first in the trees, a broader hush sweeping through leaves and needles, then a soft stirring around the cabin corners. Crickets continue their tireless fiddling. Somewhere farther off an owl calls, low and hollow, a sound that seems less like speech than like the night clearing its throat. Owls were common companions to rural darkness, useful hunters and convenient material for superstition. Some believed their calls foretold death or misfortune. Others merely accepted them as feathered neighbours with gloomy voices. The frontier was fertile ground for strange beliefs. Charms against illness, bits of folk magic, signs read in dreams, and protective customs all travelled west in saddlebags and memory. Some settlers nailed horseshoes above doors. Some placed certain herbs near sleeping places. Others spoke of odd lights seen near swamps or claimed that particular cries in the night meant weather was turning. Such beliefs mixed old European traditions, native knowledge borrowed imperfectly, and local invention. A lonely landscape invites explanation. Human beings rarely leave mystery unattended. You kneel by your bundle and draw out the blanket fully. The wool rasps against itself with a dry whisper. It is rough, yes, but thick enough to hold warmth if wrapped properly. You spread it over the bed, then sit to test the mattress again. It sags in one place and resists in another. The straw shifts with an indignant rustle. One springy stalk immediately announces its presence against your thigh. Honest furniture, very direct. You take a moment to rub your hands, pressing warmth back into the fingers after sewing. The skin feels tight and a little smoky. Fine dust from the day lingers at your knuckles. No luxury washing basin waits nearby. Only a modest amount of water and a practical sense of priorities. Still, you dampen a cloth and wipe your face. The coolness wakes you briefly. Dirt comes away in faint streaks. Clean enough. The phrase returns, sturdy as ever. By now, full dark has settled with authority. The cabin exists as an island of light in an ocean of black timber and open sky. Beyond the door there may be deer stepping softly through weeds, a fox slipping along the tree line, or nothing at all except moving air. You do not need to know every detail. In fact, not knowing may be a mercy. The imagination is already industrious enough without better materials. A brief thud lands somewhere outside, or not close to the door, but not far either. You hold still. Another sound follows. Lighter, like something brushing against brush or knocking wood against wood. Then stillness. Perhaps a branch nudged loose by wind. Perhaps an animal nosing through deadfall. The frontier at night specialised in unfinished explanations. Rarely did it offer the neat satisfaction of a clear answer. Most noises arrived, troubled the mind, and withdrew before naming themselves. You reach for the rifle, not with panic, but with that careful economy of movement born from old caution. The stock feels smooth in some places, rough in others where use has worn it. Your thumb checks the lock, your ears stay open. Nothing more. After a moment, you rest the weapon across your knees and return to listening. This, too, is part of supper on the frontier. You eat, you mend, you pause, you measure the dark. Then you go back to ordinary things, because fear cannot be allowed to chair every meeting. A curious fact from some early American households concerns nightcaps, not the drink. Though that certainly appeared too, but the actual soft caps worn to bed. Men and women often slept in them to preserve warmth, especially in draughty houses. There is something humbling about remembering that the nation's broad frontier story included people facing the wilderness in little cloth caps while trying not to freeze. History is rarely improved by too much grandeur. At last the room feels arranged for the night, not perfectly, but sufficiently. The meal is finished. The tools lie where they should. The mended shirt is folded. The candle waits. The fire breathes in a low red hush. You sit quietly and let the warmth settle into you while the crickets keep their endless measure, and the woods answer only with wind. Sleep has not arrived yet, but the cabin is ready for it. And sometimes readiness is the nearest comfort a long frontier evening can offer. By the time true night settles over the clearing, the cabin has taken on a different character. It no longer feels like a place you entered. It feels like a small creature itself, crouched under the trees, holding its breath with you inside. The fire keeps low company in the hearth, sending out a steady warmth and a smell of charred pine. Shadows lie in the corners like folded cloth. The walls show every seam and notch in the shifting light, and the whole room seems built from patience, fatigue, and wood that was never asked whether it wanted this new life. You rise from the stool and begin the slower work of arranging the night. This is not dramatic work. That is precisely why it matters. You place each object with care, as though the dark will test your memory later, which of course it will. The rifle goes within easy reach from the bed, angled where your hand can find the stock without fumbling. The powder horn rests nearby, but not so near the fire that carelessness might turn a quiet evening into a very short history lesson. Your knife lies flat on the shelf. The axe stays by the door, ready for wood, for trouble, or for the kind of practical crisis frontier people politely grouped under the large heading of necessity. Touch guides much of this work. The stock of the rifle feels smooth from handling, polished by sweat and years rather than fine craftsmanship. The axe handle is rougher, with tiny ridges raised by weather and use. The knife's wooden grip holds the warmth of your palm for a moment before cooling again. Such objects are companions more than possessions. They are touched daily, trusted often, and cursed occasionally with deep sincerity. The cabin answers your movements with its own little sounds. The floor gives a low wooden complaint beneath your stockinged feet. The shelf creaks when you lean near it. A loose peg in the wall rattles faintly as you hang a coat. Nothing here stays fully silent. Even stillness has texture. Somewhere above, perhaps in the loft space if there is one, dried wood shifts and gives a small tired tick. You look up without thinking. Then you smile to yourself a little. A lonely room makes you suspicious of architecture. Near the bed, you set the candle and strike a spark. The wick catches after a second attempt, then steadies into a thin yellow flame. Compared with the hearth, it is a meek little thing. Still, it pushes back a useful circle of darkness. The The tallow smell drifts outward at once, faintly greasy, almost sweet in an unhelpful way. Candlelight is never flattering. It makes the blanket look older, the walls more uneven, and your own hands more worn. Perhaps that is why it suits frontier life so well. You take a moment to inspect the door once more. The bar sits in place. The iron latch is secure. The wood around it is scarred where use has darkened the grain. A cabin door in 1815 carried a burden far beyond its size. It was supposed to keep out weather, animals, strayed dogs, wandering pigs, drunken visitors, and on rare miserable occasions, people with worse intentions. That is a lot to ask of a few boards and some iron fittings. Still, people asked it every night. Many frontier homes were built with astonishing economy. A single room often served as kitchen, bedroom, workshop, and sick room all at once. In poorer settlements, several people might sleep together for warmth and space. Yet solitary sleeping did happen, especially for travellers, hunters, hired labourers, widowers, and settlers occupying cabins ahead of their families. To be alone at night was not unheard of. It simply sharpened every small uncertainty until ordinary caution felt like a form of prayer. You kneel by the hearth and shift a log with the poker. A bright seam opens. Heat brushes your face and dries the skin around your eyes. You add just enough wood to keep the coals alive without letting the room grow too hot. A roaring fire may look cheerful, but it eats fuel and makes sleep uneasy. Better a steady bed of heat that can endure the deeper hours. Banking a fire well was one of those domestic skills that never received public applause and absolutely deserved it. The smell of the room changes as the fresh log begins to catch. Resin sharpens in the air. Smoke thickens for a moment, then threads upward. Your nose carries traces of supper still lingering on the iron pot, mixed now with wax, wool, and damp leather from the boots set nearby. It is a dense frontier perfume, heavy with the facts of living. There is no floral note. There is no elegant finish. Yet the blend has a logic. It tells you exactly where you are and what this night requires. You sit on the edge of the bed and test the reach of your arm toward the rifle. Easy enough. Good. Then toward the candle. Also good. Then the blanket. Better. These little rehearsals would look ridiculous in a ballroom and perfectly sensible in a log cabin. Darkness rearranges confidence. It turns a misplaced object into a source of irritation, then danger, then language unsuitable for church. You would rather avoid all three. Outside, the wind has dropped lower into the grass. You can hear it now, not as a broad sweep in the treetops, but as a gentler passing hush around the clearing, as though invisible hands were smoothing the weeds flat and letting them rise again. The crickets continue their steady, rasping chorus. Once in a while, another insect adds a sharper buzz, then stops abruptly, perhaps reconsidering the value of performance. Farther off comes the dry bark of a fox or the short, uncertain cry of something smaller, objecting to existence. Nightlife on the frontier had no talent for staying in the background. You remove your outer shirt and fold it with care. The evening cool touches your arms at once. Skin that felt warm by the fire now notices every draught. You pull on a nightshirt if you have one, or simply loosen your day clothes for sleep. Modesty on the frontier existed, certainly, but practicality generally had the louder voice. Warmth mattered. Ease of movement mattered. Looking picturesque did not. A curious tidbit from early American domestic life is that some people stuffed herbs into bedding, or tucked them into cracks near sleeping places. Lavender, pennyroyal, wormwood, cedar, and mint were all used in different regions for fragrance, comfort, or to discourage insects. Whether they worked especially well is another question. Historians still disagree on how effective many such remedies were, though frontier people often trusted what had been handed down by mothers, grandmothers, neighbours, or one extremely confident person who once had an opinion near a fireplace. Tradition travelled faster than proof. You lift the blanket and slide a hand across the mattress. Straw shifts under the ticking with a dry rustle like brittle grass under a boot. Here and there a stiff end presses upward through the fabric, waiting to make its point later. You pull one out and toss it aside. The blanket itself feels scratchy but substantial, a proper working blanket made less for softness than survival. Fine linen sheets existed in gentler worlds. Here, wool rules with a stern face. The window draws your eye. It is shuttered now, yet some slender ribbon of moonlight finds a way around the edge, laying a pale line across the floorboards. The sight is almost beautiful, which feels mildly suspicious. The wilderness spends all day reminding you of labour and risk, then offers a graceful sliver of moon through the cracks as though it has suddenly become poetic. Very clever. You do not entirely trust beauty that appears after dark. Still, the moonlight shows the outline of the room in another register. The hearth glows amber. The candle burns soft gold. The moon casts a colder silver across the floor and the lower part of the wall. Between those colours, the cabin feels divided into small kingdoms of heat and chill, each holding its ground. You sit quietly and watch the line tremble when the flame moves. It is a calm sight. It is also one more reminder of how thin the walls are between you and the world outside. You reach for a bit of cloth and wrap it once around the metal parts of the rifle where the candlelight glints. Metal cools quickly in this air. A cold barrel is no tragedy, but the touch of cold iron in the dark can startle the hand enough to make it clumsy. Clumsiness is a frontier tax collected at unfortunate moments. Best to pay less of it. Then there comes a brushing sound along the outer wall. Not a heavy impact, not a human tread, more like fur, branches, or loose brush dragged by the wind. You hold still and listen. The sound moves a little, then stops. Another faint rustle, then silence. Your heartbeat grows larger in your ears. That is the truly rude thing about fear. It creates extra noise just when you most need less. Perhaps it is only a low branch scraping. Perhaps a curious raccoon has climbed onto the woodpile. Perhaps a stray dog from some distant homestead has wandered through. On the American frontier, cabins drew attention from creatures of every size. The smell of grease, scraps, smoke, stored grain, and human warmth formed a kind of invitation, though not one you had sent with enthusiasm. Wolves generally avoided close approach to occupied cabins, but foxes, raccoons, opossums, and rodents had fewer reservations. Chickens and pigs often paid the price for that boldness when they were present. You stand, take the candle, and move slowly toward the wall where the sound seemed strongest. Tallow light shakes with each careful step, throwing your shadow long and thin across the logs. You pause and angle your head. Nothing now. Only the fire's soft breathing and the thin, sore edge of crickets outside. You touch the wall with your fingertips. The wood is cool, slightly rough, and steady under the hand. A little vibration from the wind. Perhaps. Or perhaps the night is enjoying itself. There was a common frontier understanding that imagination could become almost as troublesome as any wild animal. Letters and memoirs from the period sometimes hint at nights when ordinary sounds grew monstrous simply because darkness provided no visible correction. A settling roof became footsteps. A whippoorwill became a cry. Wind under the eaves became whispered talk. Scholars are cautious about these recollections, because memory loves drama. Yet no one who has lain awake in a lonely place would dismiss them entirely. The mind is inventive, especially when tired. You return the candle to its place and sit again. This time you remove your stockings and place them inside the boots to keep them warm and discourage them from becoming oddly shaped by morning. The floor feels even colder now beneath bare feet, rough enough to catch at the skin. You climb onto the bed with a slight grunt that sounds louder than it should. The mattress gives way grudgingly. One hip sinks lower than the other. You shift, then shift again, creating a landscape of tolerable discomfort. The blanket comes up over your legs, then your waist, then your chest. It scratches a bit at the neck. You tug it lower. The wool holds a faint smell of lanolin and old smoke. Under it, warmth begins slowly, gathering first where the fabric presses close. Your body meets the stored coolness of the bedding and starts to conquer it inch by inch. Sleep on the frontier often began as a negotiation with cold cloth and lumpy stuffing. The candle flame narrows. The hearth pulses red and orange. Their combined light makes the rifle's outline visible near the bed, reassuring in a practical way. Not because you expect an attack. Most likely nothing will happen at all. Yet being prepared lets the body surrender some part of its vigilance. That is often the real purpose of such arrangements. You do not build a fortress. You build enough confidence to close your eyes. A low moan moves through the chimney as the wind shifts again. For one brief foolish instant it sounds almost human. You stare toward the hearth. Then the note breaks apart into the ordinary drafty language of imperfect masonry. Cabins produced a whole theatre of strange voices at night. Whistling gaps, sighing flues, tapping shutters, scratching walls, and the occasional mysterious thump from no agreed source. Rural children grew up with these noises and often learned to ignore them. Adults pretended to have learned the same lesson. You lie back carefully and place one arm across your middle. The blanket weighs pleasantly on your chest. Above you, the ceiling beams are half lit, half hidden. Smoke stain darkens the wood overhead. You can smell the day lingering in your own skin, mixed with the scent of fire and blanket. Your shoulders begin to lower. Your jaw unclenches a little. Outside, the distant woods continue their obscure business under the moon. There is comfort in the arrangement now. Not luxury. Never that. But a workable order has been made. The tools are placed. The fire is judged. The door is barred. The candle watches in its small, weak way, in a world where the nearest help may be far beyond a dark ridge. This little circle of readiness becomes its own kind of shelter. You listen to the crickets, the wind, and the soft settling noises of the cabin around you, and at last you begin the long frontier art of trying to sleep while remaining only half convinced that the night has agreed to let you. Sleep does not arrive in a heroic sweep. It edges closer, then drifts off again, like some cautious visitor peering through the doorway and deciding the room is not quite to its taste. You lie still beneath the blanket, watching firelight move along the walls, and discover that the dark outside has become busy in 100 small ways. Night on the frontier is never empty. It only hides its workers better. The first thing you notice is the pattern of crickets changing. Earlier, their sounds seemed like one continuous field of noise, a single dry silver thread stretched around the clearing. Now you hear separate patches answering one another from different distances. One cluster sings close to the cabin wall, quick and sharp. Another hums from the weeds near the woodpile. Others pulse farther off near the tree line, fainter, almost swallowed by the open dark. The effect is strangely orderly, as if the grass itself is breathing in sections. Then the wind speaks up. It comes low through the clearing at first, rocking the weeds with a soft, restless hiss. A moment later it rises into the trees and becomes broader, fuller, turning leaves and needles into a long whispered rush overhead. The cabin answers with a slight shiver. The chinking between the logs creaks. A loose board somewhere overhead gives a dry little tap. You pull the blanket closer under your chin and listen to the whole place react. Wood against wood, flame against air, as though the house is quietly complaining about conditions. A snap comes from outside. You open your eyes wider. It is a clean sound, short and hard, like a branch stepped on or pushed past under weight. Then silence follows so suddenly that the fire itself seems too loud. You hold your breath, your ears strained toward the door. Nothing. Only the pulsing insects and the slow murmur from the hearth. In daylight, one broken twig would not mean much. At night, in a lonely cabin, it becomes a full committee meeting in the mind. You wait for another sign. There is none. That is often how the wilderness behaves. It gives you one small sentence, then declines to explain itself. A deer moving through scrub can sound enormous. A squirrel in dry leaves can briefly resemble a disaster. Yet there are nights when your instincts sharpen for good reason. And frontier living depends on not dismissing every concern as nerves. You lie still between those possibilities, which is not the most comfortable place for a human mind to rest. The fire settles a little lower. Coals glow deep red beneath a skin of grey ash, and one small flame bends sideways as a draught slips through the room. The warmth still reaches the bed, though less generously now. Your feet notice first. Cold always begins negotiations at the extremities. You flex your toes under the blanket and hear the faint dry rasp of wool against rough ticking. The mattress rustles in reply, making a noise like brittle grass pressed under a boot. Another sound arrives, this time from farther away. A thin, rising howl lifts beyond the timber, carrying over the clearing with a strange, hollow purity. It hangs there for a breath, then fades. A second call answers from another direction. Not close, but not so distant that you can dismiss it entirely. Wolves. Very likely wolves. By 1815, grey wolves still moved through broad stretches of the American frontier. Settlers feared them, cursed them, hunted them, and told stories about them with a level of intensity that sometimes exceeded the real danger they posed to people sleeping indoors. Livestock had more reason to worry. Even so, hearing them at night does something unmistakable to the spine. You stay motionless. The calls do not come again at once. Instead, the crickets resume their steady work, and the wind shifts through the trees with a longer, deeper sound. Almost like surf if you close your eyes and let imagination travel somewhere much less complicated. But the howls have changed the atmosphere. The woods no longer feel merely dark. They feel inhabited in a more deliberate way. You picture narrow bodies moving through black timber, paws soundless on needles and the leaf mould, noses lifted to the damp air. Much of frontier fear lived in imagination. But imagination was not always foolish. People who kept pigs, calves, or sheep had good reason to guard them. Wolves and panthers could take animals, and stray dogs caused their own trouble. There were also stories, some true and some embroidered beyond mercy, of animals drawn near cabins by scraps, by scent, or by mere curiosity. It is one thing to know a beast is somewhere in the forest. It is another to hear it announce itself while you lie under one blanket with a wall of logs between your ribs and the night. A small tapping begins near the shutter. Not heavy, just not urgent. Just a quick dry tick, then another. You turn your head slowly. The sound comes again. Tap, tap, tap. Then a fluttering scrape. Your heart gives one rude, hard thump before reason catches up. Some moth or beetle has found the faint glow inside and decided to make poor life choices against the covering. You exhale through your nose. Frontier nerves receive little rest, but they do get exercise. The tapping continues for half a minute, then stops. Now that it is gone, you miss it almost immediately, because its disappearance leaves a wider silence to fill. A different noise takes its place, one lower and more uncertain, from near the back wall. A dragging brush, then a pause. Another brush. You sit up a little on one elbow. The rifle catches a glint of firelight beside the bed. You can smell cooling ash, candle tallow, and the faint raw scent of old wood warmed all evening and now giving back its heat. You tell yourself it may be no more than weeds rubbing the outer wall. The explanation is reasonable. Reasonable explanations, however, do not automatically slow the pulse. The sound comes once more, then stops altogether. The night has a talent for withdrawing evidence just when you start to assemble a theory. There were plenty of noises frontier people learned to identify with surprising precision. The cough of a fox, the bark of deer, the screech of an owl, the squeal of a frightened rabbit, the grumbling rustle of raccoons in corn. Yet some sounds remained stubbornly ambiguous, especially around cabins where wood, wind, creatures, and imagination all worked the same shift. Historians still argue whether later recollections exaggerated the terror of these moments. But even a modest, honest account is enough. A lonely room magnifies uncertainty without any help from literature. You swing your legs carefully over the side of the bed. The floor feels cold enough to make your skin tighten. You reach for the candle, shield the flame with your palm, and rise slowly so the mattress does not protest too loudly. The cabin appears different from standing height at this hour. Shadows gather beneath the stool and shelf. The door seems farther away, the ceiling lower. Candlelight throws your own outline against the wall in a lanky shape that looks capable of trouble, though sadly it is only you. Step by step, you move toward the shutter. The flame trembles with each movement. Melted tallow runs a little down the side of the candle and warms your fingers where it touches. You pause near the window and listen. Nothing. Just the ever-present insects and the little breathing sounds of the fire. The shutter itself is cool beneath your knuckles. You do not open it. You are curious. Certainly. But not so curious that you wish to put your face against a dark opening in the middle of the frontier night. Curiosity is a fine trait until it acquires a draft. Instead, you stand there and let your ears work. A faint rustle comes from low in the grass outside. Then a quick scuttle away from the wall. Small feet, most likely. Perhaps a mouse or rat. Perhaps something larger, but still harmless. Frontier cabins attracted all sorts of visitors interested in crumbs, warmth, nesting places, and the intriguing smell of human dinner. You picture a raccoon with nimble paws and entirely too much confidence, inspecting the edge of the building as if considering a rental arrangement. Back near the hearth, a log collapses inward with a soft shower of sparks. You turn at once. For an instant the room brightens, orange and lively, then settles again. The sparks die among the coals. You kneel and nudge the wood into place with the poker, feeling heat bloom across your cheeks and the backs of your hands. The smell of fresh smoke thickens briefly in your nose, sharp and almost sweet. A thread of it stings your eyes. You blink and sit back on your heels. This is when a new noise reaches you. One that does not come from the wall or the shutter or the tree line. It comes from above. A slow creeping movement across the roof, then a faint thump. You freeze with the poker in hand. Another creeping sound follows, scratchy and cautious, travelling a short distance before stopping. It could be a branch shifting in the wind and brushing the shingles. It could be an animal testing the roofline. Perhaps a raccoon or possum climbing where it should not. It could also be the sort of noise that lets the imagination arrange itself in unhelpful costumes. You stare upward as though the planks might volunteer a confession. No confession comes. Only one more soft scrape, then stillness. You set down the poker and remain crouched near the fire for a while. Perhaps because the warmth is pleasant. Perhaps because kneeling feels quieter than standing. Perhaps because any creature clever enough to walk your roof deserves a moment of thoughtful consideration. A curious bit of frontier folklore held that odd sounds overhead could signal anything from weather changing to spirits wandering. The practical mind blamed branches and animals. The more superstitious mind kept options open. In isolated settlements, folk belief often nestled right beside common sense without either one fully driving out the other. At length you return to the bed and sit with the blanket pulled around your knees. The candle stands beside you, the flame now shorter and steadier. Its smell has deepened into that familiar warm tallow note, not pleasant exactly, but companionable in its own greasy little way. Your hands still hold some heat from the hearth. You rub them together once and listen again. Far off, a barred owl calls, its voice rounded and hollow. Then from another part of the darkness comes the sharp, frantic chirr of insects disturbed by something moving through the weeds. Then quiet. Then wind. Then a single hard knock from somewhere out near the woodpile. The frontier does not produce one grand, terrifying sound. It produces many modest ones, layered one over another, until your thoughts begin supplying faces and motives for each. You lie back again, this time on your side, facing the room. The rifle is visible, the candle is visible. The red bed of coals remains visible too, low and dependable for now. These things matter. Seeing them steadies you. Outside the cabin, the wilderness may continue its endless errands under moonlight, but inside there are known objects in known places. In uncertain conditions, that is nearly luxury. Your eyes drift toward the door. The bar still holds. The line beneath the threshold is dark. No shadow crosses it, yet the mind, once encouraged by noise, does not easily return to innocence. You find yourself listening not only for beasts but for footsteps, human ones, measured and deliberate. Solitary cabins sometimes house travellers passing through, men who might be decent enough, or not. Banditry on the frontier was less constant than later legends like to suggest, yet theft, trespass, and ugly encounters certainly existed. A person alone at night had reason to keep more than wolves in mind. That human possibility has its own flavour of fear. Animal sounds belong to nature. Human sounds imply intention. The thought passes through you and settles near the ribs like a stone, though the night offers no evidence to support it. Still, frontier people often had to balance hospitality with caution. A knock after dark might mean a freezing traveller seeking shelter, or it might mean the opposite of peace. That uncertainty made every latch feel important. The woods answer your unease with another long, far howl, this one lower and rougher than before. It drifts over the clearing and fades into the cricket song. Then the wind freshens. You hear dry leaves skitter near the doorway. The roof gives a soft mutter. Somewhere a night bird lets out a brief startled cry. The cabin remains standing, the fire remains alive, and the noises go on, making the darkness feel crowded. You let your head sink deeper into the rough pillow. It smells faintly of straw, wool, and human sleep collected over many nights. The scent is oddly grounding. Your breathing begins to slow, though not by much. Tiredness presses at last on the back of your eyes. That may be the great secret of frontier rest. You do not wait for perfect peace. You surrender because fatigue eventually outranks caution. Even so, the dark keeps speaking. Crickets rasp in the grass. Wind rubs the treetops. A branch knocks once against something unseen. The roof remembers its visitor with a tiny late creak. From deep in the woods comes the last faint suggestion of wolves moving through their own ancient hours. Wrapped in wool, surrounded by candle glow and red coals, you lie awake in the middle of all that sound, learning how a lonely frontier cabin can feel both like a refuge and a listening post at the edge of the unknown. Toward the deeper part of the night, after the noises have introduced themselves and your nerves have grown tired of reacting, a different kind of awareness settles over you. It is not exactly calm, it is more practical than that. You begin to understand that surviving alone on the frontier in 1815 depends less on bravery than on habit. Bravery burns quickly, habit stays up late, mends the shirt, bars the door, banks the fire, and remembers where the knife is without needing applause. You lie under the blanket and feel those habits holding the night together. The rifle near the bed, the candle placed where your hand can reach it, the boots turned upright by the hearth, the bar across the door. These are small arrangements, almost dull from the outside, yet they form a private system of order against everything beyond the walls. A person can endure quite a lot if the next motion is already known. That was one of the true lessons of the American frontier. Popular stories loved the image of the fearless settler hacking through wilderness with broad shoulders and a heroic jaw. Real life had less interest in jaw lines. It favoured repetition, sharpen the blade, dry the powder, save the grease, keep the blanket mended, store food off the floor if possible, though the mice would certainly file objections. Great triumph often rested on very ordinary discipline. A long, low gust presses at the cabin and slips away again. You hear the logs answer with a soft complaint. The sound no longer startles you as it did earlier. Already the ear is learning. That is another frontier lesson. You do not conquer fear all at once. You sort it. You separate the harmless from the urgent, or at least try to. A creak in the wall becomes part of the house. A scratch in the corner becomes a mouse. A distant howl becomes information, not prophecy. It is imperfect work, but useful. Sleep still hovers at a distance, so you sit up and swing your feet to the floor. Cold rises through the boards at once, firm and unwelcome. You pull the blanket around your shoulders like a shawl and move back toward the fire, carrying your own little nest of warmth with you. The wool rubs against your neck in a coarse drag. It smells faintly of smoke and sheep. Comfort on the frontier had texture, and most of it scratched. You crouch by the hearth and stir the coals very gently. Orange veins open under the grey ash, glowing like something alive under old stone. Heat touches your face first, then your hands. The room brightens just enough to show the outlines of the stool, the shelf, and the bed. Shadows retreat a little, then wait. You feed the fire one short piece of wood, no more. Waste was dangerous in a place where every stick had been cut, dragged, split, and stacked by effort. Wood itself shaped frontier life more than many grand events. A cabin, a fence, a trough, a bucket handle, a stool, a spoon, a coffin, a gun stock, a plough part, a bed frame. All emerged from forests that seemed endless until someone had to turn trees into daily necessities. Settlers judged land not only by soil, but by timber. Good wood meant fuel, shelter, tools, and leverage against winter. A treeless place could be beautiful and still feel almost unusable to people trained by wooded frontiers. You hold your hands toward the coals and notice how rough the skin has become. Dry knuckles, tiny nicks, a patch on one finger where some earlier task scraped away the top layer and left it tender. Living close to tools changes the hands first. Historians can count population movement and land claims, but the body tells its own quieter history. Shoulders toughened by chopping, back stiff from lifting, feet reshaped by distance, sleep itself altered by vigilance. Outside, the wind drops. For a few breaths the clearing seems held in stillness. Then the crickets return to the front of your hearing, bright and steady, like thousands of tiny metal files drawn along fine teeth. A whippoorwill calls from somewhere beyond the tree line. Its repeated notes carry that eerie frontier quality of sounding both near and impossible to locate. People of the period knew that call well. Some found it soothing, others took it as a bad sign, especially if illness lived in the house. Human beings do love giving birds administrative roles in destiny. You sit on the stool and let the blanket wrap around your knees. Alone at this hour, you begin to feel how much frontier life depended on mental habits too. Not just labour, not just caution, but the management of thought. You cannot give every sound the dignity of terror. You cannot spend every evening imagining ruin. At some point the mind must agree to carry uncertainty without chewing on it constantly. That is not easy. It may be one of the hardest frontier skills of all. Many settlers had routines for this very reason. Evening prayers, quiet reading, tool cleaning, corn shelling, mending. Simple repeated acts that guided the mind away from the dark's more dramatic suggestions. Routine was not merely a schedule, it was emotional architecture. In a world of weather, illness, crop failure, animal trouble and distance, familiar tasks gave shape to time itself. A person who followed the same sensible order each night could feel less at the mercy of chance. You take up the whetstone and the knife from the shelf. A few passes only. No need to overdo it. The blade slides along the stone with a dry, silky hiss. Metal against grit. Pause. Turn. Draw again. The sound is small but absorbing. The edge catches candlelight when you test it with your thumb, carefully, not enough to be foolish. Sharp enough. Good. Tools left neglected had a way of choosing the worst possible day to fail. That principle extended to nearly everything on the frontier. A roof repaired too late welcomed rain. A wheel not checked could split on the road. A loose shoe could lame a horse. Powder allowed to dampen might misfire. Salt pork stored badly might spoil. And because help was distant, each small neglect carried larger consequences than it might in a town. Historians sometimes call this a world of contingency. You might call it a world where forgetting one simple thing could make you miserable by breakfast. The knife goes back on the shelf. You look toward the door again, though there has been no new sound from it. The habit of checking becomes almost soothing. A secure door is rarely noticed during the day. At night it becomes a whole philosophy. There is something humbling about how much peace can depend on a bar of wood set in place with care. A fringe belief from some frontier communities held that the manner in which a cabin settled at night could reveal things about weather. If the logs popped sharply, some claimed colder air was coming. If the chimney drew badly and smoke lingered low, rain might follow. Whether these notions worked consistently is difficult to prove. Scholars remain uncertain about how many weather sayings were reliable local knowledge and how many were simply memorable coincidences that survived because they sounded wise. Still, when you live by sky and season, even doubtful signs become tempting. You rise and move toward the shelf where a bit of meal and wrapped food remain, not because you are hungry exactly, but because it is wise to check what the night has not stolen. You lift the cloth. Still there. Good. A person alone can become slightly possessive over half a heel of bread. And honestly, that is only sensible accounting. Food out here is not just comfort. It is time. It is labour preserved. It is tomorrow's strength waiting quietly in edible form. The mouse in the wall resumes its industrious scratching, this time with a confidence that suggests it has mistaken your patience for surrender. You rap the shelf with your knuckles. Silence. One tiny victory. Frontier life offered many such triumphs, none likely to earn a statue. You keep the bread covered and shift it farther from the floor, because mice are persistent, and respect for your opponent is part of strategy. When you return to the bed, you do not lie down at once. Instead, you sit and listen to your own breathing. There is a moment in solitary nights when the body begins to understand that no rescue, interruption, or conversation is coming. It is simply you, the room, and the long hours. Oddly enough, that realization can bring relief along with loneliness. Once there is no one else to depend on, every practical thing you have done becomes more visible. The fire burns because you tended it. The door is barred because you checked it. The room is manageable because you arranged it. That quiet self-reliance sat at the heart of many frontier myths, though the myths often forgot how heavily even the most independent people still leaned on neighbours when they could. Cabin raisings, shared harvests, exchanged tools, borrowed salt, midwives, communal hunts, news carried by travellers. All these form the true web of frontier life. Solitude existed. Yes, but so did interdependence. The image of the completely isolated settler is useful for legend and less accurate for most everyday realities. Even the loneliest cabin usually belonged to a larger pattern of help, memory, and expectation. Tonight, however, those larger patterns are somewhere beyond your sight, here, in this room. Independence feels less like a slogan and more like a list of chores completed in the right order. The thought is oddly grounding. You pull the blanket back and lie down once more, this time settling more carefully into the hollows of the mattress. The straw shifts under you with a soft whisper. One stubborn stem makes itself known near your shoulder. You remove it with tired dignity and toss it aside. The candle has burned lower, melted tallow pools at the base and hardens in pale ridges. The flame leans briefly, then rights itself. Your eyes trace the ceiling beams, dark with smoke, and then drift to the thin pale line where moonlight sneaks around the shutter. The room is no grand fortress, it is a rough box of timber and willpower. Yet plenty of human history took place in rough boxes just like this. Children were born in them, meals were cooked, illnesses were endured, letters were written, news was traded, prayers were spoken. People laughed in them too, on better nights than this one. You think of how many frontier people must have lain awake exactly this way. listening not just for danger but for reassurance. The cow still quiet in the lean-to, the baby finally asleep, the rain easing from the roof, the horse shifting in the yard, the dog giving one lazy bark and then settling again. Sound was information. Sound was company. Sound told you whether the world outside your eyelids remained ordinary. Historians still debate how much frontier hardship has been romanticised by later generations, who wish to see national character forged in noble discomfort. There was certainly discomfort enough. Yet people did not endure it because hardship looked splendid in hindsight. They endured it because land, work, hope, desperation, debt, family plans, and sheer lack of alternatives pushed them onward. That truth makes the nightly routines even more striking. Survival was not a pageant. It was housekeeping under pressure. The crickets continue. The fire lowers. The mouse, offended by your authority, begins scratching again in some new hidden seam. You almost admire the creature. Persistence recognizes persistence. Wind passes lightly across the cabin and brushes the wall with a feathery hush. No great alarm follows. No urgent knock, no heavy tread. Only the layered sounds of a world that remains active while you try to withdraw from it. At last your shoulders loosen into the bedding. The rifle waits nearby. The candle keeps its small watch. The door remains barred. Habit has done its quiet work. Out beyond the clearing, the frontier stays wide, imperfect, and indifferent. Inside the cabin, you learn the humbler truth that keeps people alive more often than boldness ever did. You do the necessary things in the necessary order, and when the night presses close, that order becomes a kind of courage. At some uncertain hour, when the candle has shortened to a tired stub and the fire has settled into a bed of red eyes, the night changes again. It does not grow louder exactly. It grows more specific. Earlier, the darkness felt full of general possibility. Now it seems to have chosen a point just beyond the cabin and fixed its attention there. You feel it before you can name why. The skin along your arms tightens under the blanket. Your breathing slows on its own. Somewhere outside, something is moving with purpose. You do not sit up at once. First you listen. There is the familiar wash of crickets in the grass, thinner now in places where the night air has cooled. There is the soft occasional murmur of wind easing through the trees. There is the tick of a coal collapsing inward. Then, between those sounds, there comes a faint tread in the clearing, a press of weight, a pause, another careful step, not the scrambling quickness of a raccoon, not the light erratic motion of a rabbit. This has a measured quality that wakes every waiting nerve. You roll quietly onto one elbow and stare toward the door, though of course the wall offers no view. The blanket slips a little from your shoulder, and cold air finds the skin at once. You pull it back with slow fingers. The wool rasps softly. Even that small noise feels reckless. The tread comes again, followed by a faint brush through dry grass. Then stillness. Your hand finds the rifle stock beside the bed. The wood is cool, solid, familiar. You do not lift it yet. You simply rest your palm there and listen as if the contact itself might sharpen the ear. Outside, nothing. Then, from the far side of the cabin, a brief sniffing sound, low, investigative. It drifts near the wall and disappears. You imagine a nose raised to the chinking, testing smoke, food, leather, tallow, salt, and human presence. The frontier was full of creatures curious enough to inspect a cabin, but not quite bold enough to commit to mischief. It might be a fox, it might be a stray dog, it might be a wolf keeping a cautious distance. Wolves interested themselves more in livestock than in occupied cabins, but hunger and curiosity are old trespassers. You picture a lean shape at the clearing's edge, silvered by moonlight, ears high, body held in still concentration. That image may be true. It may also be your imagination putting a handsome coat on uncertainty. The sound shifts toward the back corner of the cabin, a faint scrape, Then another. You rise slowly from the bed, taking the rifle with you, careful not to jostle the stool or strike the shelf. The floor feels like cold bark under bare feet, rough and hard enough to keep you alert. Your knees bend slightly to quiet your steps. The room looks smaller when you move through it armed, as though objects have pulled in close to avoid involvement. The candle flame, low and weary, draws a frail line of gold along the barrel. You stop near the hearth and listen again. Nothing. The fire gives off a dry, hot scent mixed with ash and the faint sweetness of sap from the last stick of pine. Smoke lingers under the chimney throat before finding its way upward. You can taste it a little at the back of your mouth. Your own heartbeat seems louder now, though not wildly so. More like a drum heard through a wall. Present, insistent, entirely unhelpful. Then comes a different noise. 2 short knocks against wood. Not at the door, lower than that, along the outer wall. You hold still, the rifle angled down but ready. A branch might do it. So might an antler, if a deer has wandered too close. Yet there is something deliberate in the spacing that keeps you from dismissing it. Knock, pause, knock. Then a rustle trailing away in the grass. The cabin seems to lean into the silence after it. A lonely night has a way of offering unfinished messages. That may be its most irritating habit. You move toward the door, not because you intend to open it, but because you want to hear more clearly. The bar sits in place. The wood smells faintly of old rain and handling. You lower your head near the seam and listen through the crack. A cool draught brushes your cheek. Outside there is only the small restless orchestra of the clearing, insects, grass, a very distant owl. Nothing close enough to justify all this tension, which is exactly when tension feels least interested in reason. People on the frontier often had to make judgments from scraps of evidence like these. Tracks at dawn, a sound by the henhouse, a missing scrap of bacon rind, a horse uneasy in its tether, a snapped beanpole. Rarely did danger step into view and announce itself with tidy clarity. Most trouble began as hints. One of the most useful survival skills was learning when a hint deserved action and when it deserved a tired shrug. The difficulty, naturally, was that both answers could feel correct until too late. You glance toward the shuttered window. For one absurd second you consider lifting it a fraction and peering out. The idea dies quickly. Looking into blackness is one thing. Offering blackness a neat opening at face height is another. Frontier caution may not be glamorous, but it often lives longer than curiosity. The scratching returns. This time unmistakably near the woodpile outside. Something shifts a piece, nudges bark, and pauses. Then comes a soft chuffing exhale. Animal. Oh, almost certainly animal. Your shoulders drop an inch, though only an inch. Animals make sense. Animals follow hungers and habits. Humans, on the other hand, bring ideas with them, and ideas are much less reliable. That thought passes through your mind with unwelcome clarity, because there is always the other possibility. A traveller, a drunk, a thief, someone lost, someone desperate. The American frontier in 1815 was not an empty stage occupied only by noble settlers and photogenic wildlife. Roads were poor, distances were long, and strangers appeared with regularity in settlements and isolated homesteads alike. Most were ordinary enough. Some needed food, directions, or shelter. Some carried news. A few carried trouble. Hospitality was expected in many places, yet so was caution. Those two virtues could spend an entire evening glaring at each other over a barred door. You remain near the hearth, listening for a human sign, a cough, a muttered word, a boot heel. Nothing arrives. Only another faint scuffle at the woodpile and the sound of something moving away into the grass. The relief is real, though modest. One mystery solved by reducing it to mere animal presence. Frontier life often asked you to be grateful for that sort of downgrade. A curious old tale circulated in some backcountry regions about wolves that would circle cabins silently, not howling at all, only watching the firelight through cracks in the walls. The story was told with confidence by people who had likely never met a wolf at conversational distance. Whether such tales had any basis in repeated observation is uncertain. Historians remain cautious, and with good reason. Frontier storytelling was a generous host to exaggeration, especially on winter nights when a little extra drama helped the cornmeal go down. Still, you cannot help glancing at the seams between the logs. Moonlight touches one edge of the floor where it finds a narrow path around the shutter. The line is pale and quiet. No shadow crosses it. The room smells of banked fire, old wool, and cooling tallow. A small bead of wax slides down the candle and hardens on the holder in a crooked ridge. The ordinary details reassert themselves. They are strangely comforting. A person alone clings to details because they stay still while the mind wanders. Then, just as you begin to settle, there comes a new sound from much farther off. Voices, or perhaps not voices exactly. More like one drawn-out cry. Then another, thin and uncertain over distance. You straighten at once. The calls come again, but warped by wind and trees until they blur into something between animal and human. Coyotes can do that. So can foxes. So can people if the night pulls their sound long and strange through the timber. You stand motionless, trying to separate tone from distance, distance from meaning. The effort gets you nowhere. The cries fade. Silence returns. Then a barred owl speaks from nearby with such sudden richness that you nearly laugh from the shock of it. The sound spills through the clearing, round and resonant, and for a moment the whole business seems ridiculous. That is another frontier truth. Fear and comedy share a thin wall. 1 minute you're listening for intruders. The next you're nearly unnerved by an owl doing excellent work. You lower the rifle slightly and sit on the stool. Your feet ache faintly from the day and now from standing on cold boards too long. The stool wobbles in its usual way, as though no emotional event is important enough to improve its construction. You rest the rifle across your knees and keep listening. The room breathes around you. The hearth settles. The candle trembles once, then steadies. Outside, the woodpile receives no more visitors. Many people in isolated places develop the habit of silent waiting. It sounds passive, but it is not. Waiting is work when every sense is engaged. You sort through layers of noise, compare 1 minute with the next, and decide whether change means threat. Hunters did it. Mothers did it with sick children. Farmers did it in storm season. Night travellers did it by campfires. The frontier taught people to wait with intention. Your eyes drift toward the door again. Suppose someone did knock. What then? Open at once and risk foolishness. Refuse and risk cruelty. Speak through the door first, certainly. Keep the rifle nearby. Listen for the tone of the answer. Yet even then, what can tone tell you in darkness? A frightened man may sound dangerous. A dangerous man may sound perfectly calm. The night offers no easy rules. This uncertainty appears often in old recollections of cabin life. People wrote of strangers appearing after dusk, asking for lodging or food, and of the quick private assessments that followed: accent, clothing, horse condition, manner, eyes, the presence of weapons, which on the frontier proved almost nothing because everyone respectable owned them too. Scholars still debate how widespread serious violence really was in remote districts compared with the later legends. But no matter the actual numbers, the perception of vulnerability was enough to shape behaviour, especially when a person faced the latch alone. A faint clatter from the roof interrupts the thought. Something small runs across overhead in a short, hurried line and disappears. You tilt your head back, likely a possum or raccoon. Not elegant, but at least comprehensible. The wilderness. Having failed to provide a villain that keeps sending understudies. At last the tension drains enough for fatigue to make itself known again. It arrives heavily, all at once, in the shoulders and behind the eyes. You rub your face with one hand and feel the roughness of skin dried by smoke and weather. The cabin is quiet now, or quiet by frontier standards. which is to say alive with tiny harmless sounds and temporarily free of larger ones. That may be the best any person can ask. You stand, return the rifle to its place beside the bed, and lower yourself carefully back onto the mattress. Straw whispers under your weight. The blanket comes up around you, trapping warmth that the room no longer offers freely. You lie on your back and watch the candle shrink itself towards sleep. Outside, the clearing keeps its secrets. Whether the night's visitors were fox, wolf, raccoon, drifting cries in the timber, or merely your own imagination giving shape to every uncertainty, the effect has been the same. The darkness feels inhabited. You feel it too, yet the cabin still stands around you, stubborn and sufficient, and that has to count for something. Somewhere after midnight, the night loses its edges and becomes a long, dim stretch of endurance. The earlier sounds no longer arrive as separate events with neat little bursts of alarm. Instead, they seem woven together into one continuous fabric of wakefulness. A dark cloth made of wind, insects, cooling wood, distant cries, and the steady reminder that you're not sleeping nearly as well as you had hoped. This is the hour that tests people most, not the dramatic beginning of night, when every sense is alert and pride still carries you. Not the approach of dawn, when relief begins to leak into the sky. This middle depth is harder. It feels endless. It feels personal. You wake again without knowing when you drifted off. That is the first annoyance. The second is the cold. It has gathered while you slept in patches, creeping into the room from the floor, from the walls, from every seam in the cabin that daytime could pretend did not exist. Your nose feels cool above the blanket. One hand, left too near the edge of the covers, has gone stiff enough to complain when you curl the fingers. The mattress beneath you has lost whatever friendliness it briefly possessed earlier. Every hollow feels sharper now. Every stem in the stuffing seems to have developed ambition. You lie still for a moment, trying to judge whether the fire can survive until morning without help. The room glows faintly from the hearth, but only faintly. Red embers sit low under ash. Breathing like tired creatures, they could last. They could also fail just before dawn and leave you waking to a cabin cold as a cellar. That possibility is enough. You push back the blanket and sit up. Cold meets your chest and neck at once. It is not severe winter cold. It is more intimate than that. Sly and persistent. The kind that slips along the skin and settles in joints, already worn by the day. Your bare feet find the floor and recoil slightly. The wood feels almost damp with night chill, though when you touch it with your toes it is only hard and rough. Still, the body interprets it as insult. You stand anyway, blanket wrapped around your shoulders, and shuffle toward the hearth, with the solemn dignity of a person whose main enemy has become temperature. The coals answer when stirred. A few bright points open at once, then more, orange under the grey. You crouch low and feed them thin scraps first, listening to the tiny dry crackle as the wood catches, then a somewhat thicker split piece. Flames rise reluctantly, then with growing interest. Good. Heat spreads toward your face in a soft push. Smoke slips crookedly upward. Your eyes sting for a breath. The smell of fresh kindling joins the older smell of ash, wool, and stale tallow. Midnight on the frontier has its own particular fragrance, part campfire, part fatigue. You hold out your hands until the fingers stop aching. The skin across your knuckles looks pale in the firelight, cracked here and there from work and weather. The warmth reaches slowly, first as tingling, then as relief. Behind you the bed waits in its lumpy silence. Nearby the rifle remains where you placed it, dimly outlined in the rising glow. You glance toward the door from habit, bar still in place. Good. A person alone at night develops routines so repetitive they begin to resemble ritual. Yet ritual has value when the hours refuse to move. Sleep on the frontier was often segmented, though not always by preference. People woke for weather, for animals, for children, for embers, for bodily discomfort, for pain in overworked muscles, for the simple fact that rough houses made rough nights. Modern ideas of one smooth, uninterrupted rest fit poorly with cabins, field labour, and uncertain conditions. Some households even treated the middle waking period as normal, using it for prayer, checking the fire, or handling small chores. That makes the night sound organised. In truth, much of it was just tired persistence with a blanket around your shoulders. Outside, the wind has nearly disappeared. Without it, smaller noises come forward. Crickets still chirr, but less vigorously than before, their rhythm slowed by the cooling air. A single insect near the wall gives a sharp repeated pulse that seems far louder than its size ought to allow. Somewhere under the floor, or perhaps just outside the foundation stones, a tiny scampering motion begins and ends. Mouse, no doubt. The frontier did not grant full night silence to anyone except perhaps the dead, and even they probably had opinions about roots. You settle onto the stool and let the fire warm your knees. Fatigue makes everything feel slightly unreal now. The cabin appears both familiar and strange, as though you were borrowing it from someone else's life. The shelf, the pot, the boots, the folded shirt, the candle stub leaning in its holder, all of it seems arranged by a person who was more competent a few hours ago. That person was you, of course. But the middle of the night is excellent at making your earlier self appear impressively organised. A short dry thump comes from outside the back wall. You do not leap this time. Progress. Instead, you raise your head and listen with narrowed eyes, almost annoyed more than alarmed. Another faint sound follows, a sort of scraping nudge in the grass, then nothing. Some animal turning over a stick, perhaps. A branch settling. The night is full of unfinished business. You remain still and let the fire crackle lightly. No second thump comes, no circling tread. Eventually you decide the sound belongs to the category of things that can be endured without ceremony. This ability to rank disturbances may be one of the most underrated frontier skills. Not every alarm deserved equal honour. If you rose in full panic for every creak, you would collapse from exhaustion before the week was done. If you ignored everything, you might lose food, livestock, sleep, or worse, living well depended on calibration. Which noises were weather, which were pests, which were predators, which were strangers, which were merely your own thoughts wearing boots? Historians still debate how quickly newcomers learn these distinctions, because the records tend to come from people writing after they had already survived the worst of ignorance. The first nights were probably more bewildering than later memoirs like to admit. You lean back slightly and listen to the fire. There is comfort in its logic. Wood catches, sap pops, embers settle inward. Flame feeds or fades according to visible rules, not like the forest, which hoards explanations. The heat brushes your face and dries your lips. You rub them absently and taste smoke on your fingertips. It is a grounding sensation. So is the ache in your shoulders. A steady reminder that the day was real and not just an elaborate rumour invented by fatigue. A curious tidbit from early rural households is how often people shared beds, not always from intimacy, but from necessity, economy, and warmth. Travellers bunked together, children piled in rows, workers doubled up in cold weather. To sleep alone in a frontier cabin was therefore a particular kind of experience. You gained space, certainly, but lost the simple reassurance of another person breathing nearby. Even an annoying snore can become a luxury when the alternative is listening to wolves, mice, and your own imagination all bidding for attention. That thought makes the room feel lonelier than before. You notice the empty air beside the bed, the absence of conversation, the lack of any second pair of boots by the hearth. Solitude can feel sturdy during the day, almost proud. At night it changes shape. It becomes a hollow around ordinary objects. The stool looks more solitary. The cup on the shelf seems to belong to no one. The door takes on a heavier burden because only you are behind it. There is no one else to wake, no one else to say that was just the wind, no one else to hear the joke if you mutter one to steady yourself. So you mutter one anyway, nothing brilliant, just some dry remark to the fire about loyalty or about the floor trying to freeze your feet clean off. The sound of your own voice in the cabin is oddly soothing. It lands softly and proves that human speech still belongs in the room. A fringe habit noted in some personal recollections suggests that people alone for long stretches often spoke to animals, tools, fires, or themselves without considering it madness at all. It was simply a way of pressing back against silence. Under the circumstances, cookware made decent company and seldom argued theology. You rise and check the shutter once more. The wood feels cool beneath your fingers. A thin leak of moonlight still edges around one side, though the angle has changed. The moon must be travelling lower now. That little visible fact offers a strange comfort. Time is moving whether sleep does or not. The night is not stuck. It only feels that way. You go to the door and place a hand lightly on the bar. Solid. The iron latch is cold enough to sting. You stand there listening through the crack near the frame. The outside air smells of damp earth, dead leaves, and cooling grass, with the faintest animal note woven through it. Too faint to name. The clearing itself seems quieter now, though not empty. Something out there gives a soft rustle and stops. Then, from far beyond the trees, a drawn-out howl rises once and fades. Only one voice this time, thin, distant, almost lonely in its own right. You return to the hearth feeling less alarmed than reflective. Wild sounds are easier to bear when they remain at a distance. It is the near and unnamed noises that gnaw. A distant wolf belongs to the world. A scratch at your wall feels personal. You crouch and add no more wood, deciding the fire is sufficient. Better to conserve what you have and trust the coals to carry you through another span of hours. When you climb back into bed, the blanket's retained warmth feels like an earned reward. You tuck the edge around your shoulders and settle onto your side. The pillow is no masterpiece, lumpy and faintly dusty, but your head welcomes it anyway. Your eyes close for a few breaths, then open again as the cabin gives a long, subtle creak from one wall to the other. Cooling wood, nothing more. The sound passes through the room like a thought too slow to become speech. This half-sleep becomes the pattern of the hour. You drift down and surface again. A dream begins, then is broken by a coal shifting in the hearth. You turn over. Straw whispers under you. Your hip complains. Your feet finally warm. Then one grows cold again. Time stretches strangely when broken into such pieces. A few minutes can feel like a mile walked uphill. Many people from this era measured night not by the clock, if they had one, but by signs. The moon's position, the strength of the fire, the silence of certain birds, the first call of roosters if there were many nearby, the gradual paling before dawn. In remote cabins, timekeeping could be imprecise and deeply physical. You knew the hour by your bones, by the air on your face, by how many times you had already turned the pillow in search of a cooler or warmer patch. At one point you wake fully convinced someone has spoken outside. You open your eyes at once and listen so hard that your jaw tightens. Nothing, only the old insect chorus and a tiny whisper of grass against grass. Perhaps the voice belonged to a dream. Perhaps some bird made a sound that the sleeping mind translated into language. Human ears love words so much that they occasionally invent them. You exhale slowly and let the tension drain. It occurs to you that the most exhausting visitor tonight may be not beast or stranger, but the imagination itself, hard-working and deeply unhelpful. Still, there is something admirable in staying awake when needed, in checking the fire, in listening, in deciding, guess, again and again, that the next noise does not require panic. These are not heroic gestures. No ballad will celebrate you for putting another stick on the coals while wrapped in an itchy blanket. Yet this is how many frontier nights were truly survived. Not by dramatic conquest, but by stubborn, reasonable wakefulness through the least glamorous hours. The fire lowers again, but more gently now. The cabin seems to relax around it. Even the mouse has ceased its industry for the moment. Your eyelids grow heavier. The cold remains, though less sharp. Outside, the vast dark landscape keeps turning under the stars, indifferent and immense. Inside, you lie alone among wood smoke, wool, and rough timber, waking and dozing by turns, learning how long the hours after midnight can feel when dawn is still only a rumour. By the time the night has worn itself thin enough for fatigue to feel heavier than fear, your mind begins reaching for older explanations. This happens easily in lonely places. Practical thoughts manage the first part of the evening. You check the latch. You tend the fire. You listen for paws, hooves, footsteps, weather. But as the hours stretch and sleep comes only in broken pieces, stranger notions begin to rise from memory, from hearsay, from the sort of stories people tell when darkness presses too closely and ordinary facts seem just a little underdressed. You lie on your back and stare into the dim cabin, where the fire has sunk to a low red murmur and the candle has nearly surrendered. The room is softer now, less defined. Corners blur. The shelf fades into shadow. The roof beams hover above like dark ribs. Outside, the crickets have thinned to a more hesitant rhythm, and the wind has taken on that cooler, emptier voice it keeps for the deepest hours. This is when old beliefs feel least foolish. On the frontier, superstition travelled almost as well as flour and salt. Settlers brought signs, charms, warnings, and household remedies from England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, Africa, and elsewhere, then altered them to fit new landscapes. Some customs had clear practical roots, others hovered somewhere between habit and hope. A horseshoe above a doorway, a sprig of certain herbs near the bed, a whispered verse against bad luck, a refusal to sweep after dark, a careful eye on which birds called near the house. No one needed to be entirely gullible to make room for such things. It was enough to be tired, isolated, and aware of how much remained beyond control. You turn your head toward the shutter. A thin leak of moonlight still marks the floor, pale as bone. It makes the room feel watched in a gentle, indifferent way. That sensation reminds you of tales told in cabins and around cook fires, stories about light seen in swamps, shadows moving where no person stood, or voices heard near the tree line after midnight. Most likely. Many of those stories were born from fatigue, fear, weather, and an imagination with too little supervision. Yet when you lie alone in a rough cabin with the world reduced to sounds and outlines, you begin to understand why such stories survived. There were many strange remedies too, some sensible, some peculiar, and some so odd they seem invented by a bored fever. People slept with onions in rooms against illness. They carried little bags of camphor, sulphur, or herbs. They rubbed goose grease on chests, tucked garlic nearby, or placed particular roots under pillows. Some families believed certain plants kept evil away. Others trusted Bible verses written and folded into pockets. A practical person could laugh at such things by daylight and still feel faintly comforted by them after midnight. You shift beneath the blanket. The wool scratches at your chin. The mattress complains softly under your shoulder. Somewhere in the wall, a tiny dry movement suggests the mouse has resumed its own household business. The sound is oddly reassuring now. A mouse is mundane. A mouse belongs to the world of crumbs and corners, not omens and spirits. You would happily accept an entire parliament of mice over one truly unexplained sound. A log settles in the hearth with a little sighing collapse. You watch the glow brighten and then dim again. The room smells faintly different at this hour. Less smoke now, more old ash, spent tallow, dry timber, and that cool wool smell that blankets develop after long use. There is also the lingering scent of your own skin, worked clothes, and the day's labour tucked into every fibre. These earthy human smells matter. They keep the cabin anchored in ordinary life, a place that smells of food, wool, leather, and soot feels harder for ghosts to manage effectively. Still, people in 1815 did not divide the world as neatly as later generations like to pretend. Religion, folklore, home remedies, and practical labour often lived side by side without much quarrel. A man might load his rifle carefully, sharpen his axe with skill, and still think twice if an owl cried 3 times near the roof. A woman might know exactly how to make soap, dry apples, and mend a harness, yet also pin a charm into a child's clothing during sickness. The frontier encouraged realism, but it did not erase mystery. If anything, the wilderness gave mystery better staging. You close your eyes for a moment and remember hearing that a whippoorwill calling near a house could mean death was near. In some regions, people believed that if the bird called a certain number of times, or perched too close to a window, it carried a message no one wanted. Rationally, it is nonsense. A bird is a bird and the night is full of them. But rationality is not always the loudest voice in a lonely cabin. The memory lingers a little longer than you would like. Then, as if the night has overheard you, a whippoorwill calls from beyond the clearing. The sound is soft at first, then clear, repeating itself with patient, eerie precision. You stare toward the shutter and feel the old story try to attach itself to the sound. It is irritating how quickly the mind cooperates with superstition when half asleep. You pull the blanket higher and remind yourself that birds are not clerks of mortality. The call continues for a time, then drifts farther off, becoming only one more thread in the dark. Scholars still disagree on how seriously such beliefs were held by frontier households. Some may have repeated them almost jokingly, as family sayings carried more by habit than conviction. Others likely believed them deeply, especially in times of illness or grief. Written evidence is uneven because people rarely pause to label their own assumptions as superstition. They simply lived with them. The line between tradition and fear can be difficult to trace after 200 years, and perhaps it was difficult to trace in the moment as well. A curious fringe belief from some rural communities held that dreams occurring close to dawn carried more truth than those earlier in the night. Another claimed that if you heard your name called outdoors when no one was there, you should not answer. There were warnings against looking too long into dark windows, against counting certain stars, against bringing particular plants into the house, against stepping over a child while it slept, against letting a rocking chair move empty. The human species has shown impressive creativity in giving anxiety decorative clothing. You turn on your side and face the room again. The candle has finally gone out, leaving behind a faint greasy smell of extinguished wick. Without it, the fire becomes the only true light. The red coals throw a low breathing glow that reaches the underside of the stool and barely outlines the bed frame. Everything else has softened into shadow. The change makes the room feel older, simpler, and somehow more honest. Candlelight belongs to people. Emberlight belongs to something deeper and less social. There is a small comfort in knowing that countless others have watched such coals through such hours, not because they were enchanted, but because they were too tired, too uneasy, too cold, or too wakeful to do otherwise. A banked fire had practical value, of course. It meant warmth preserved, labour spared, mourning made easier. Yet people also stared into embers because embers moved just enough to occupy the eyes without requiring thought. In a long night, that can feel like mercy. Outside, something gives a single cry that sounds remarkably like a child, then cuts off. Your whole body tightens before reason steps in. Fox, perhaps. Maybe a screech owl. Several creatures make sounds in the dark that seem designed to insult human nerves specifically. You wait for a second cry, but none comes. The silence afterwards swells and settles. You're left mildly annoyed at nature's sense of humour. The frontier produced not only wild animals and rough weather, but also rumours of less definable dangers, witches, signs, haunted roads, bewitched milk, dreams that foretold accidents, strange figures seen near riverbanks, burial grounds avoided after dusk. Some of these tales reflected older European lore brought across the ocean. Some blended with local fears and misunderstandings. Some perhaps emerged from encounters people could not explain and did not care to examine closely. Isolation tends to make stories root deeply. When neighbours are far apart, news travels slower and imagination has more room to farm. You think briefly of illness, because illness was one of the shadows people feared most and understood least. Fever could arrive like weather. A strong body could fail in days. Frontier medicine offered bleeding, purges, poultices, tonics, herbs, prayers, and confidence in wildly varying proportions. Some remedies helped, some harmed, some simply gave the hand something to do beside the bed. No wonder people clung to signs and warnings when so much suffering seemed to come with no understandable cause. The thought leaves the room feeling more fragile. The rough walls, the blanket, the tools, the stored food, all of it protects against some things and not others. A wolf can be kept at a distance by fire, walls, and noise. A storm can be prepared for. A stranger can be measured through caution. But fever, grief, and misfortune pass through doors without knocking. That awareness made many frontier people both practical and devout, both skeptical and suspicious, sometimes in the same afternoon. You hear a faint tapping overhead and look up at once. Just one little patter crossing part of the roof, then nothing. A possum, perhaps, or some small creature finishing its own mysterious errands. The sound is ordinary enough, but in this dimness it joins the wider atmosphere of signs and omens too easily. You almost laugh at yourself. Almost. Then you settle deeper into the bedding and try to let the moment pass. Many households had bedtime prayers that served not only devotion but composure. Spoken words brought order to uncertainty. A familiar phrase could steady the mind much as checking the latch steadied the hand. You don't need to recite anything elaborate to feel the value of that impulse. Quiet words, even unspoken ones, gather a person inward. They draw a boundary around fear. Whether that boundary is spiritual, emotional, or simply habitual may not matter much when dawn is still far away. The fire sinks lower. The coals now are more red than orange, more pulse than flame. Their light strokes the underside of the roof beams and leaves the rest to darkness. The mouse has gone silent again. The whippoorwill is gone too. Even the crickets seem fewer. The whole clearing feels as if it is holding still for a while, gathering itself before the sky begins its slow change. You breathe in the cool, smoky air and let your thoughts loosen from their grip on old tales. The frontier was full of odd beliefs, yes, but it was also full of long nights that stretched the nerves thin enough to make any story seem momentarily possible. That may be explanation enough. A lonely cabin, a tired body, half sleep, shifting sounds, and miles of black timber can turn almost anyone into a collector of omens. So you lie quietly in the dim ember glow, among rough boards, wool, and the worn smell of human living, and let the strange beliefs of the frontier drift through your mind without settling there completely. Outside, the unseen world continues with its own purposes. Inside, you remain very much alive, very much awake, and only partly persuaded by the old stories that still know how to knock when the night grows longest. At last the night reaches that peculiar hour when it feels less like a passage of time and more like a test of endurance, designed by someone with a private dislike of comfort. The fire has burned low again. The air in the cabin has cooled into a thin, steady chill. Your body is tired enough to ache, but not tired enough to surrender cleanly into sleep. This is the long wait for dawn, when morning seems less like an approaching certainty and more like a rumour started by optimists. You wake without knowing whether you slept at all. The cabin is dim except for the faint red glow in the hearth. A few ember eyes staring out from ash. The darkness has changed texture. It no longer feels lively and curious as it did earlier. Now it feels heavy, almost used up, as if the whole wilderness has been awake too long and is growing stern with exhaustion. Even the crickets outside have thinned to a scattered pulse. The pauses between their notes are longer now. The silence around them feels broader. You lie still and listen. No scratch at the wall, no tread in the clearing, no cry from the trees. For a brief moment, the quiet itself becomes suspicious. Then a small stirring of grass returns, and a low murmur of wind touches the cabin side. The world has not stopped after all. It is only slower. Your own breathing sounds larger in the hush. The blanket has slipped from one shoulder, and the exposed skin has gone cool. You tug the wool back into place and feel the rough fibres drag across your neck. Even that small warmth seems hard-won. This last portion of night can be cruel because it arrives after you have already spent most of your courage. Early evening has preparation. Midnight has alertness, but the hours before dawn ask for patience when patience is already worn thin. On the frontier, people often rose before sunrise for chores, travel, baking, livestock, and field work. Waiting for dawn was not merely poetic longing. It was practical impatience. Light meant tasks could resume, and tasks were often easier to bear than uncertainty. You push yourself upright and sit on the edge of the bed. Every part of the cabin seems to have grown stiffer in the cold. The boards beneath your feet feel harder than before. The stool by the hearth looks accusatory, as if blaming you personally for the fire's decline. You wrap the blanket around yourself and stand, moving slowly so the blood can catch up. Your joints complain in quiet, believable ways. The frontier never let the body forget it existed. At the hearth, you kneel and study the embers. Not dead, not thriving, still alive enough to argue. Good. You stir them gently with a stick. An orange appears beneath the grey, then deepens. A faint little crackle answers. You feed the coals dry splinters first, then a narrow strip of split wood. Flame licks upward with reluctance, then steadies. The light expands across the room in a soft breathing wave. The smell of renewed fire rises at once, sharper than old ash. Tinged with sap and faint smoke, you inhale it like medicine. There is a special comfort in reviving a fire at this hour. It does not feel cheerful exactly. It feels corrective. It puts one thing right in a world still mostly dark. Heat begins to brush your hands and face. Your feet, however, remain offended by the floor. You edge them closer to the hearth and hold the blanket tight around your knees like some weary monarch of a very poor kingdom outside. A single gust passes through the clearing and brushes the cabin wall with a long, low hush. Then comes a dripping sound from somewhere in the trees, perhaps dew or lingering moisture shaken loose. The air smells colder now, even through the cracks, carrying earth, bark, damp grass, and the worn metallic edge of pre-dawn. The wilderness seems to have emptied itself of theatrics. No wolves now, no tapping at the shutter, no uncertain cries, only distance, chill, and the feeling that everything is waiting. That waiting gets into the mind. You begin to watch for dawn as if watching alone might persuade it to arrive sooner. The shutter shows only black with the faintest suggestion of paler black at one edge. Though you're not sure whether that is real or wishful seeing, the moonlight line that crossed the floor earlier has vanished. The moon is lower now or gone from your angle. Time is moving. That much can be trusted. A strange truth of cabin life is how much hope can gather around tiny visual changes. One corner of the shutter turning less dark, the coals glowing stronger, the outline of the shelf becoming clearer. In towns, dawn spreads gradually across many surfaces and sounds. In a solitary cabin, you hunt for it like a clue. Light is not yet a general condition. It is a rumour appearing first on wood grain and cracks. Many people living on the frontier measured their mood by the condition of the morning fire. A strong bed of coals suggested competence, comfort, and a better start. A dead hearth meant delay, cold fingers, and extra labour before anything else could begin. In that sense, dawn was never only symbolic. It came attached to chores: bread to bake, water to draw, animals to tend, tools to lift, clothing to put back on while still stiff from the night. Morning's mercy was practical. You rub your face with both hands and feel the dry tightness of skin marked by smoke and weather. Sleep has left your eyes gritty. Your mouth tastes faintly of ash and stale, cold air. It occurs to you that people in paintings of frontier life often look remarkably composed for individuals who almost certainly woke with sore backs and smoky mouths. Art is generous that way. Reality prefers honesty. A small thump comes from outside. Not near the door, farther out. You look up at once, but the sound is so modest you're more curious than alarmed. Perhaps a rabbit moving through brush. Perhaps something dropped from a branch. No second noise follows. The clearing feels calm in a worn-out way, like a room after guests have left. Even your nerves do not bother climbing all the way to alarm. They simply note the sound and set it aside. This is another sign of the approaching morning. The imagination grows less theatrical when dawn nears. What felt ominous at midnight becomes merely inconvenient by first light. A scratching wall becomes a mouse again. A cry in the trees becomes a fox. A shifting shadow becomes brush. Darkness lends grandeur to uncertainty. Grey light takes some of that grandeur back and reveals the ordinary machinery underneath. Still, the last stretch remains long. You sit on the stool and hold your hands toward the fire while the blanket falls around your shoulders in heavy folds. The wool smells of sleep, lanolin, and old smoke. Your legs are tired. Your neck is stiff. The stool rocks once on its shorter leg and settles, as if even furniture cannot fully commit to stability at this hour. From outside there comes the faintest rustle of leaves, then silence again. The cabin seems suspended between two worlds, one not yet gone and the other not quite here. A curious old belief held that the hour before dawn was especially dangerous for dreams and troubled thoughts, because the soul travelled strangely when the body was weakest. Whether anyone fully believed that depended on region, family, and how much cider had accompanied the telling. Historians remain uncertain about how widespread such ideas really were, though fragments appear often enough in rural traditions to suggest they had a life of their own. What is certain is that people noticed this hour. They felt its weight. It invited reflection whether they wanted it or not, and reflection comes easily now. You think not in grand speeches, but in simple human ways. How good hot food would taste. How different the room will seem once daylight reaches it. How much warmer your boots might feel after a little more time by the hearth. How absurdly noble a flat wooden stool begins to look when it has supported you through half the night. Solitude pares down thought. By this hour, luxury means warmth, light, and the chance to stop listening so hard. Then, at last, a bird. One note first, small, tentative, then another from farther off. You hold still. The sound is unmistakable. Not because it is loud, but because it does not belong to the reign of midnight. It belongs to morning's borderlands. A little while later another bird answers, and then the silence changes shape entirely. It is no longer night silence. It is waiting silence, thinner and more breathable. You turn toward the shutter, and now there is no doubt. The edge is lighter, not bright, not even properly grey yet, but different. The black has begun to loosen. Relief arrives gently. It does not burst in. It settles into your shoulders, eases your jaw, and lets the room feel human again. The door is still just a door. The shutter is only wood. The sounds outside belong to creatures finishing one shift and beginning another. Somewhere beyond the clearing, the sky is making up its mind, and you can feel the wilderness changing around that decision. The first hints of dawn often came with a rise in chill before warmth followed. Frontier people knew that trick well. Morning did not begin by being kind. It began by revealing surfaces and asking for labour. Yet even the cold feels less personal once it is visible. You can fight what you can see. You can put boots on, feed the fire, step outside, and meet the day with whatever energy remains. It is the blind hours that do the worst work on the spirit. The room grows clearer by slow degrees. The shelf returns from shadow. The stool becomes merely shabby instead of mysterious. The rifle's outline sharpens near the bed. Your boots sit where you left them, patient and already slightly less accusing. The beams overhead show their smoke stains. The floorboards reveal their rough grain. Nothing has changed, and yet everything has. Daylight has begun the quiet miracle of making the ordinary visible again. You rise and go to the shutter, resting your fingers against the wood. It feels cool, slightly damp near one edge. Through the tiny crack at the side comes the faintest wash of pre-dawn grey, soft as breath. You do not open it yet. There is pleasure in this small, private moment, in feeling the morning arrive without fully admitting it. The cabin, after all its creaks, whispers, and uncertainties, has held through the whole long night. Many frontier memoirs speak of dawn with gratitude that sounds almost religious. Even when no formal prayer appears on the page, that makes sense. Light restored proportion. It proved the world had not disappeared. It gave back colour, distance, direction, and work. Perhaps most important, it reduced the authority of fear. A clearing seen in daylight becomes measurable ground. A tree line becomes only trees again. The mind, so dramatic in darkness, must submit to evidence. You turn back toward the fire, which now burns with modest confidence, and let the blanket fall a little from your shoulders. The night is not entirely gone, but its hold has broken. Outside, one more bird calls, then another. Inside, the cabin no longer feels like a listening post on the edge of the unknown. It feels once more like what it is, a rough shelter waiting for morning to cross the threshold. And you, after all the long watching, sit in that soft first grey and wait for the day to become real. At last you lift the shutter and let the morning in. The first light does not rush. It enters with restraint, pale and grey at first, then slowly silvering the edges of the cabin until each rough object returns to itself. The shelf is only a shelf again. The stool becomes a stool, wobbling and unglamorous. The rifle by the bed looks less like a promise and more like a tool. Even the corners, which held such uncertain shapes in darkness, now reveal nothing more sinister than shadow, soot, and the honest neglect of hurried building. A ribbon of cool dawn air slips across your face as the opening widens. It carries the smell of damp grass, churned earth, bark, and the faint, clean wetness that settles over a clearing near morning. After the long enclosed night of smoke, wool, ash, and tallow, that outside air feels almost luxurious. You breathe it deeply. Your lungs seem to wake before the rest of you does. The sky beyond the cabin is washed in thin colour, not yet gold, but lifting steadily from slate into pearl. Trees stand dark against it, every branch still, every trunk more ordinary than it appeared in moonlight. The clearing lies quiet and slightly silvered with dew. Low weeds bend under droplets. The woodpile sits where it always sat, innocent in appearance despite the suspicions it inspired during the night. The world has resumed its daytime habit of looking explainable. That is one of dawn's great talents. It does not remove danger from the frontier, but it strips away the grand costumes fear wore in darkness. A rustle becomes grass, a cry becomes a bird or fox, a shape by the wall becomes a stump, a shadow, or a heap of split bark. Morning is less merciful than people claim, because it often reveals how eagerly the mind decorated the unknown. Still, you welcome that honesty. You stand for a moment with one hand on the shutter and let your eyes move across the clearing. The earth shows what the night withheld. There are marks in the dirt near the woodpile, but smaller than Dread had imagined. Perhaps raccoon prints, perhaps some other little midnight inspector. Near the edge of the grass, a few bent stems suggest where something passed. No heavy track approaches the door. No sign of human footsteps leads through the clearing. The cabin was visited, yes, but only by creatures with modest ambitions and excellent timing. A person alone on the frontier learned to read mornings as carefully as others read letters. The ground could tell stories. A scuffed patch near the trough. Hoof marks where none should be. Droppings in the yard. Feathers. A broken rail. Disturbed ash. One glance around the cabin at dawn gave you the summary of the night that darkness had denied. This habit was common among settlers, hunters, and travellers alike. They learned to trust disturbed earth, because earth held fewer theatrical opinions than the mind. You step away from the window and begin the small rebirth of the room. The fire needs feeding properly now. You crouch by the hearth and add a more serious stick, then another, coaxing the flames from mere endurance into usefulness. The smell sharpens at once. Fresh smoke rises, resin breathes out of pine, and warmth pushes farther into the room. The kettle or pot goes near the heat. A morning meal will not appear on admiration alone. Your body announces itself now that the long watch is ending. Shoulders stiff, lower back sore, one hip crossed from the mattress, neck tight from turning toward every small sound in the night. Your feet, though grateful for boots soon, remain unconvinced that the floor deserves forgiveness. The frontier had a way of making ordinary waking feel like a report from every joint. Even so, the ache is reassuring. Pain means you pass through the night intact enough to complain. You pull on your clothes, each layer feeling colder than expected at first. Shirt, trousers, stockings, boots. Still a little cool but workable after their time by the hearth. Leather stiffens overnight in cabin air, and your feet push into it with that early morning reluctance familiar to anyone who has ever had a task waiting outdoors. You lace and fasten everything slowly, feeling yourself return from nighttime creature to daytime worker. Outside, the birdsong builds. Not a great triumphant chorus at first, just separate notes appearing from different points in the trees as though the world is testing its voice again. A small chirr from brush, a higher, clearer phrase from a branch near the clearing, then another. Day begins by collecting confidence. The insects of the night fade backward. The air changes. Sound rises instead of pooling low around the ground. You open the door. The hinges complain softly. Then the clearing lies before you in full pre-dawn coolness. Moist earth darkens the ground. Dew touches the tops of weeds and the split faces of stacked wood. The sky to the east carries a pale, widening brightness behind the trees. The smell outside is larger than the smell through the shutter had suggested. Wet leaves, mud, faint old ash from the chimney, crushed green things underfoot. Something animal, distant and harmless. A frontier morning never smelled empty. It smelled occupied. You step onto the hard ground and stretch your back with both hands pressed at your hips. The motion sends a plain, honest ache along your spine. Better. The cabin behind you exhales a little warmth from the doorway, while the clearing cools your face and ears. That contrast feels wonderful. Human shelter at your back, open land before you. The balance between those two states shaped much of frontier existence. Too much exposure and you were exhausted. Too much confinement and nothing got done. The light is now strong enough to inspect the night's evidence. Near the woodpile, you crouch and study the soil. Small paw marks indeed. Raccoon, most likely. One split log has been shifted. No mystery there. A bent patch of grass near the outer wall suggests something brushed along the cabin, perhaps investigating smells that promised more than the place delivered. You almost admire the creature's persistence. It spent part of the night troubling your imagination, and achieved nothing more than a sniff of old wool and disappointment. Farther from the cabin, near the edge of the clearing, there is another track. Light. Cloven. Deer. The sight makes the whole night seem almost comic. How many branch snaps and soft movements had come from nervous, harmless feet passing through? Quite a few. Probably. Deer moved with enough grace to sound ghostly in darkness, and enough weight to trouble a tired mind. Dawn does not mock you for such misreadings, but it does gently correct them. This rhythm of correction mattered deeply on the frontier. People did not merely endure nights, they interpreted them by morning. What sounded large might prove small. What sounded small might prove costly if a fence had gone down or food had been raided. Knowledge grew through this repeated adjustment between dark and light. Over time, ears and judgment improved. Perhaps not perfectly, but enough. Survival was often a long education in revising first impressions. A quirky fact from early American frontier settlements is how many households kept careful, informal opinions about animal behavior, even if those opinions were not always scientifically sound. One person swore raccoons never came near on a windy night. Another insisted deer passing close to a cabin meant weather would shift. Someone else claimed fox cries were loudest before rain. Some of these notions may have held a sliver of observation. Others simply reveal how closely people watch the living world because they had to. Nature was not scenery. It was information. You gather fresh water if there is a bucket nearby, or at least check what remains from the night. The metal or wooden rim feels cold against your hand. Morning water has its own personality, crisp and severe. You wash your face with a cloth, and the chill wakes you at once, drawing the last sleepy haze from your eyes. Your skin tightens. You gasp once at the cold. Then you laugh under your breath. Because only daylight can make a person cheerful about splashing icy water on the face before breakfast. Inside again. The cabin looks transformed, not improved. Exactly. Daylight is not kind enough for that. It reveals flaws with great enthusiasm, gaps in the chinking, soot above the hearth, dust along the shelf, straw escaped from the mattress. Wax runnels hardened around the candle holder, yet those flaws no longer feel ominous. They feel manageable. There is a deep relief in objects returning to the category of chores. You set about breakfast with renewed steadiness. Perhaps you warm leftover bread, perhaps stir mush or cornmeal, perhaps heat beans or whatever plain provision remains. The smell rises thicker than last night's supper because morning hunger sharpens everything. Smoke twines with grain, grease, and hot metal. The cabin fills again with the simple chemistry of endurance. Your stomach answers quickly. Food tastes better after a bad night, not because it changes, but because your body drops all pretense and gets straight to gratitude. As you eat near the hearth, you notice how sunlight begins to edge into the doorway and touch the floorboards in a pale angled strip. Dusk glows in it. The beam creeps slowly, calm and certain. Time feels normal again. That may be the greatest gift morning offers. Night stretches, distorts, and invents. Morning resumes measurement. One task follows another. Water, fire, food, inspection, repair, movement. The world becomes countable. Historians still argue over how harsh frontier life should be described, without drifting into either melodrama or nostalgia. Some older accounts celebrated every discomfort as proof of noble character. Later critics sometimes emphasized misery so strongly that no room remained for adaptation, humour, or ordinary contentment. The truest view was likely more mixed. Cabin life could be exhausting, lonely, dangerous, and crude. It could also become routine enough that people found rhythm, pride, and even a certain rough pleasure in handling it well. Dawn after a solitary night captures that balance perfectly. Nothing has become easy, but everything feels possible again. You think of the cabin itself with a slightly altered respect. In darkness it felt thin and uncertain, little more than a shell. In daylight it proves what it is, a workable piece of human effort. Someone cut these logs. Someone hauled them. Someone notched them, raised them, chinked them, roofed them, and made a claim against weather with labour and stubbornness. That is no small achievement. Frontier houses were humble, but humble things can still be magnificent in function. You finish eating and step outside once more. Now the sun's first real colour begins to show beyond the trees, touching the upper branches with diluted gold. Dew shines more brightly. Mist, if there is any, lies low in hollows and fades as the air changes. The clearing that seemed so wide and watchful at dusk now feels almost domestic. The tree line remains dark, certainly, but no longer secretive. Birdsong is fuller. Somewhere a squirrel scolds from a branch with unnecessary confidence. The whole world seems mildly offended that you ever found it mysterious. That, too, is part of frontier life. The same land that frightened you at night demands labour from you by day with almost comic normality. Wood still needs splitting. Ground still needs clearing. Food still needs finding. Clothes still need mending. Dawn does not grant triumph so much as another shift. Yet after a solitary night, that is enough. More than enough. You stand with the cool air on your face and the first warmth of sunlight just beginning to reach the clearing. Relief moves through you, but it is quieter now than you expected. Not a grand wave, more a deep loosening, as if some knot tied under the ribs through the night has finally been worked free. You remained watchful, uncertain, tired, slightly ridiculous in moments, and fully human the whole while. The wolves stayed distant, the visitors were small, the cabin held. Morning came, and because it came, everything that troubled the darkness finds its proper size. The sounds become creatures, the shadows become corners. The long hours become one completed night on the American frontier in 1815, survived not through glory but through attention, patience, and the small useful discipline of keeping yourself and your shelter in working order until light returned. Now the day opens before you, plain and demanding and real. The clearing brightens. The cabin door stands open. Smoke rises straight from the chimney into the sharpening sky. The crickets are gone quiet. The wind has softened. Somewhere far off, beyond the trees, the wilderness carries on without concern for your relief. Yet here, in this one rough patch of morning, you feel the rare satisfaction of having made it through darkness alone and greeted first light with stiff limbs, smoky clothes, and the simple, durable gratitude of a person still standing. And now, with the cabin warmed, the tools in place, and the clearing fully emerging under the newborn day, you can let the last tension drain away. The wild noises have folded back into ordinary distance. The walls no longer listen with you. They simply stand. The floor is only wood beneath tired feet. The blanket is only wool, rough but faithful. Even the memory of the long dark begins to soften around the edges, becoming less a trial and more a fading weather that has already passed over. So you breathe in one more lungful of cool frontier air and allow the morning to settle into your body. The world is visible again. That is enough. More than enough. The light climbs slowly, tenderly now, touching the clearing, the cabin roof, the stacked wood, and the worn threshold where you stand. You no longer need to measure every sound or guess at every shape. The day has taken over that work. Your hands can rest. Your eyes can close for a moment without worry. In the quiet after vigilance, there is a softness almost like mercy. You feel the warmth of the hearth behind you, and the gentler warmth of dawn ahead. Between them, held for one peaceful moment, you stand in that narrow place where effort gives way to ease. The birds carry on in the trees. A faint breeze moves through the grass. Somewhere dew slips from a leaf and darkens the soil below. Nothing asks anything of you just yet. So at last you let the morning hold you. You let your breathing slow. You let your shoulders fall. You let the long frontier night dissolve into pale air, birdsong, and growing light. And as the sun rises over the rough American clearing of 1815, you can finally drift away from the watchfulness, away from the cold boards and distant howls, away from every uncertain sound in the dark, and settle into the calm certainty that the night is over, the cabin endured, and sleep, gentle and untroubled now, may come whenever you're ready to receive it.